Okay, so we just ended the previous video talking about skeletal muscle fiber types and energy metabolism, how there's 3 different types of muscle fibers, and each different muscle fiber likes to use different energy or metabolic pathways in order to produce force and be efficient. So speed of contraction. The speed of contraction is related to the type of myosin a fiber contains. Fast twitch fibers contain myosin with high ATPase activity rate. Slow twitch fibers have a myosin with low ATPase activity. The higher the rate of ATP hydrolysis, the faster the cross bridges can cycle and the more rapidly a muscle can shorten and contract. That makes sense. So the faster we can hydrolyze or use up that ATP and free energy, the faster those cross bridges will go, can cycle through, and more rapidly a muscle can shorten and contract. However, the price of a higher rate of shortening, so contraction cycle or rate of stretch shortening cycle, is a higher rate of ATP utilization. So oxidative metabolism is appropriate for muscles that must contain contraction for long periods of time because it produces ATP with a high level of efficiency. So when we're using oxidative metabolism, again, let's go back to what we talked about with our metabolic pathways. Let's just say we use glucose. We could use aerobic glycolysis, and one molecule of glucose can produce anywhere from 32 to 36 ATPs if we're going to go through aerobic metabolism. Now, if we use a fat molecule, we use triglyceride and break that apart into free fatty acids and a glycerol, we can use one fat molecule we can actually produce up to, anywhere between 120, 130 ATPs, which we learned about in lipolysis with fat metabolism. So a higher rate of shortening uses a higher rate of ATP, and that's going to be mainly our fast twitch fibers, and that's what we'll be using our immediate energy systems because we need energy at a very fast rate. So it would be either our immediate energy systems or our anaerobic systems where we don't need oxygen present to produce energy. Okay, so let's take a look at muscle fiber types. I said there was 3 different types of muscle fibers. You may have heard this before. There are type 1 muscle fibers, type 2A muscle fibers, and type 2B muscle fibers. So over here from left to right, we're going to go to, we have our type 1 muscle fibers, type 2A, type 2B. And we're going to go over each one. Type 1 muscle fibers are considered oxidative muscle fibers. So they like to use oxidative metabolism, and we have plenty of time to produce ATP with these muscle fibers. Examples would be our postural muscles. They have high enzymatic activity, they are resistant to fatigue, and they have high mitochondrial density. Why is that important? Because the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain both take place in the mitochondria. So the more mitochondria we have, the more potential we can have to complete aerobic metabolism. It's a very rich capillary supply to each of these muscle fibers. So a lot of blood being dropped off here. Small diameter to facilitate efficient gas exchange. So these are, if the cell is smaller in diameter, it means it has less distance for oxygen and nutrients to pass in and out of cell membrane walls, into and out of the bloodstream, and into the muscle cells. So that actually facilitates efficient gas exchange, the fact that they are smaller in diameter. They are very red in color due to their high myoglobin content. What is myoglobin? This is a protein which helps facilitate O2 diffusion into the muscle cell. So ultimately this enhances muscle contraction efficiency. So here we're going to go, these are our type 1 long distance. You can see if we were to take a histological sample and look at it underneath the microscope, we would see heavy red muscle fibers in here because, again, due to the rich capillary supply and the myoglobin content, we will see more red over here. So let's move on to the next muscle fiber type, which is type 2A, which is going to be in the middle for the most part. So these are considered our fast oxidative muscles. So they are a little bit quicker in response and power compared to type 1 fibers, but they are still not purely glycolytic. They're what we call kind of our in-between muscle fibers. So a good example here would be our calf muscles. primarily use oxidative processes, but can also function non-oxidatively. So these muscles can use oxidative metabolism, but they can also function non-oxidatively. They are moderately resistant to fatigue, so they aren't as resistant to fatigue as type 1, and they do not fatigue as quickly as type 2b fibers. They have a good amount of mitochondria as well to support oxidative metabolism, and they have moderate amounts of glycogen stored in case we need to call upon those muscle cells to help out with anaerobic metabolism. So our gastrocs and soleus are good examples of this, which makes sense because let's think about it functionally. Our calf muscles help us with walking, and our postural muscles, and which would use oxidative metabolism. However, if we want to jump or quickly sprint, we need to call upon those calf muscles as well to help us sprint as fast as we can, and that's where it will turn on into non-oxidative metabolism. So this is a good muscle example that uses both types of metabolism depending on the task what you're asking it to do. Okay, so moving on to our last muscle fiber type is our type 2b muscle fibers. These are considered fast glycolytic fibers. These are mixed within our limb muscles, mostly our flexors. A good example would be our biceps, different quad muscles. This relies on non-oxidative glycolysis. So these muscle fibers, if we were to take a muscle sample or biopsy and we were to see type 2b fibers, we would see that they have very few mitochondria. They have high glycolytic capacity. They fatigue very quickly, and they have a small amounts of myoglobin, and they are white in color versus red in color because the decrease of myoglobin, and they don't have as rich of a blood supply as compared to the type 1 muscle fibers. So we're going to look back at our diagram over here. We have our muscle fibers. Type 1 relies on oxidative metabolism. So this examples would be a good thing would be biking, long distance running, swimming, anything you need to do for extended periods of time. You'll be mainly calling upon your type 1 muscle fibers to produce energy for you to keep exercising. Middle distance running, so you're not quite at a full sprint, but you're not at a slow jog either, somewhat mid distance. You're going to use ultimately some of these muscle fibers, type 2A, which have the capacity for aerobic metabolism, but also you can call upon them to go through the glycolytic pathway if you need to produce ATP at a faster rate. So again, calf muscles are good examples of those. And then if we want to sprint or lift, let's talk about sprinting or lifting heavy weights. You want to recruit these type 2 muscle fibers because those muscle fibers are the ones that produce ATP at a very, very quick rate because they like to use anaerobic glycolysis, and they also like to use the immediate energy system. So you will call upon these muscle fibers to go through those energy systems in order to produce some sort of force. Okay, so let's talk about exercise and fiber type. Non-oxidative glycolysis is advantageous for muscle fibers that are specialized for brief, powerful contractions. So just like I said, lifting a weight, a 1 rep max, 3 rep max, even up to 10 reps, we're using ultimately fast, immediate energy systems as well as anaerobic glycolysis. The duration of the use of type 2b fibers is limited by their stores of glycogen. So remember, we were talking about, if we use glucose for anaerobic glycolysis, but we can also tap into our glycogen stores. And the amount of glycogen that we have stored will be related to the amount of output we can put out or how long we can exercise. So the better we are at storing glycogen, the better we'll be able to continue anaerobic tasks. And that's what training does. So type 1 fibers. These are innervated by small motor neurons that activate only a small number of fibers. The size principle of recruitment causes them to be recruited when small forces are required. Type 2b fibers are supplied by large motor neurons. So these are fast glycolytic neurons, muscle fibers. These are supplied by large motor neurons that activate a large number of fibers and are recruited for heavy loads. So if we want to lift or sprint quickly, which is we need our muscle fibers to produce a lot of force, we are going to call upon these type 2b fibers. Type 2a, again, have intermediate properties. The size principle provides for smooth increases in force and also activates first and most frequently. So the next slide I'm going to show you is our size principle for recruitment of different muscle fibers. All right, so this diagram is depicting the size principle and the recruitment of different muscle fibers and force production down here. So if we have low loads, we're going to recruit the smaller muscle fibers. So we're going to do type 1 muscle fibers down here because they are quickly activated and we'll always activate those first. So a good example would be for higher reps, we're still only going to be using those type 1 muscle fibers. When we want to activate those larger motor neurons as well as increase, have high force and strength development, we have to increase the amount of resistance, so force production. So for example, if we want to lift a high amount of weights from 1 to 5 rep max, we are going to need to call upon our larger motor neurons and our big motor units to activate these type 2B muscle fibers over here. Now, we will be talking pretty soon about which ones respond to hypertrophy and strength more so than the others. And these are the ones that do so. The type 2B fibers, if you're looking for a very much higher increase in strength or hypertrophy gains, you want to be activating those type 2B muscle fibers because those are what's going to give you the increase in size and girth as well. Okay, so again, here's another diagram of the size principle and recruitment. As we increase the amount of tension, our demand to recruit higher order motor units need to be recruited. So the larger motor neurons and motor units need to be recruited, which are the larger muscle fibers, our type 2B. Here's our intermediates, and then here are our type 1 muscle fibers. So if we have a low amount of tension, we'll be recruiting type 1 muscle fibers first. Here's a good diagram for you all to have to show you pretty much a summary of the type 1, type 2, type 2B fast twitch fibers. This diagram says type 2X, but that's ultimately the type 2B. So it gives you the diameter of speed. So we have type 1 over here. We're going to have a small diameter. Type 2A, we have an intermediate size, and then we have a diameter. Those muscle fibers are much larger. Speed of action relaxation. This is slow, so this is slow to activate, and it's resistant to fatigue. This is our type 2A, our fast glycolytic, our fast oxidative fibers. They are activated much more quickly than type 1. And then type 2B, these are very fastly activated and response. For force capacity, type 1 muscle fibers have a very low force output. We have intermediate for our intermediate fibers, and then we have a very high output for force for our type 2B fibers. Makes sense. We want to do 1 rep max. We're going to be show a high force capacity, and we're going to be recruiting those type 2B fibers. The rate of fatigue, so the resistance to fatigue, right? So our type 1 fibers are going to be much slower to fatigue than our other two. This falls with somewhat in the middle. And then these fatigue very quickly. That makes sense because if we're using our type 2B muscle fibers for our immediate energy systems in our anaerobic glycolysis systems, how fast do we kind of fatigue with those? Much more quickly than if we were using oxidative or aerobic metabolism. So that makes sense with regards to connecting that to the type of metabolism and producing ATP. Okay, in our next video, we're going to be continuing on the effects of training on these specific muscle fiber types, what happens during training. We're going to wrap up talking about muscle fatigue, and then we are going to go into the second half of this lecture, which we're going to switch gears and talk about motor control.